Hi there, and welcome to another Bug Bites video. Now this is the first in what's probably going to be a short series of videos on Alpine.js. This is a new lightweight JavaScript framework that you can use to build interactive web applications, and it's much more lightweight and simpler than React and Vue.js, and it also pairs really well with tools such as HTMX. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to demonstrate some of the features of Alpine, and you can see that we have the documentation open here. What Alpine gives you is some directives. These are similar to HTMX attributes. These attributes here, such as x-data, you can use these and attach them to HTML elements in order to build interactive experiences on the front end. Now, as I mentioned, Alpine is lightweight. If we scroll down here, you see that it's a collection of 15 attributes, 6 properties, and 2 methods. So in this video, we're going to demonstrate some of the basic features and we're going to build a few toy examples. So let's get started. Now, if we go to Visual Studio Code, you can see that we've got a Django template here called index.html, and at the moment this just says hello. And we're running the development server down here in the terminal. So if I go over to the page, you see that we just get hello displayed on this web page. Now we're going to extend this page and we're going to show some Alpine features. But first of all, we need to actually add Alpine to our application. So if I go back to the documentation, and this will be linked in the description. If we go to the docs, there is an installation section on the sidebar here. And there are 2 ways you can include Alpine in your project. You can include it in a script tag, or you can import it as a module here. The script tag approach is what we're going to use. As a module, you would simply install it using npm. One of the reasons I like Alpine and HTMX is that you don't actually need to use npm in your project. You can simply use Django and templates, no need for a node process whatsoever. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab this script here and we're going to add it to our base.html. So back to VS Code. In the base.html, we're going to add a comment here. This is the Alpine.js script, and we'll paste that script in here. And this will load up the latest version of Alpine into our base. And the index template that we're going to work on, this extends the base template. So we will have access to Alpine directives in the index.html file. Now I should say before we go on that this code can be found on GitHub. Now this repository will be linked in the description. But there is a master branch, that's the starter code for the project, and it's basically a Django project. It's a simple Django project with some of the setup already done, and the final code will be deployed on an Alpine 1 branch, so you can check that out if you want. But the starter code is on the master branch, so clone that and then you can get started following this tutorial. First thing to do is add the script to base.html, and then if we go to index.html, we've got access now to some Alpine.js directives. Now the first thing we're going to do is build a simple counter. So we're going to follow the example from the Alpine documentation, and then we'll extend that a little bit as well. So if we go to the Start Here section of Alpine, building a counter, we have a bit of HTML on this page. We have a div with this x-data directive. X-data is how you attach data to a particular element, and this data is then accessible from all of the child elements. So for example, we have a JavaScript object here with a key of count, which is then available in all of the child elements of this div. So you can see that we reference the count here in the x-text property. The x-text property will place the text of a particular attribute into the inner HTML, and we also attach a click event here to this button where we increment the count by 1. So it starts off with the value of 0, and then we can increment it by 1 at each time this button is clicked. So let's build that into our own template. I'm going to copy this div and we will paste that into here, and we'll get rid of the hello. We're setting the count to 0. We have a button that when we click it, it increments the count by 1. And we have a span with the text of that span going to be equal to whatever the count is at the given time. So if I save that and we load up the page, we should now see this button, and when we increment, you see it changes interactively with no refreshing of the page. So that's quite good, but we can do more than just increment. Let's add another button to this. I'm going to copy this button, and this button is going to actually square the current value of the count. So I'm going to say within the text of the button, square. To square something, we just multiply it by its current value, so it'll be this expression here in JavaScript. And this expression here, it will square the count and it will reassign the value back to the variable count. So for example, if that was 2, it would be 2 equals 2 times 2, i.e. the count would become 4. So to see this working, let's go back to the front end and we'll refresh this. Now we have 2 buttons. So if I increment this to 3 and then we square it, we should see 9. And that's exactly what we see. And if we keep squaring this, it will quickly blow up to a very large number. So it's very easy to add these interactive features into your application with Alpine.js. Now this syntax here is actually borrowed from the very popular Vue.js library. Now in Vue it's prefixed by v rather than x. What we can do is we can actually change this to a shorthand version. We can put an at before the event. So at click, and that will basically do the same thing. It just uses a more concise syntax. So on the click event, when you hit this button, it's going to increment the count by 1, and here it's going to square the value. So if we save that and go back to the page, this should still work as before, and it does. So this is a more shorthand syntax for working with events and performing actions on those events. Now the next attribute we're going to look at is the x-model attribute. If we go back to the documentation for Alpine, on the left hand sidebar, the X model is displayed here. It allows you to bind the value of an input element to Alpine data. So in the example, you've got a xData attribute here with a message, which is an empty string, and then there's an input type text. When the user types into that, it will dynamically update the message attribute in the data. So we're going to see how to do that with our counter. I'm going to add here an input at the top. It's going to be an input of type number because we're dealing with a numerical value, so we're going to say the type is number. So if we just save that and look at the front end, we should now see an input box here, and to that input box we're going to add the x-model attribute, and we simply set that equal to whatever the piece of data in our xData attribute is. In this case it's the count, so I'll copy that into here. And what this is going to do is it means that when we type in a number here, it's going to dynamically update the number on the right here, which is the actual data, the state of the data at a given time. And we can then square that data, we can increment it by 1, and we can do anything we want, and we can then reassign it back to like 2 or something like that. So now we have a way of binding what the user types into the actual data, the state that is stored in this xData attribute. So that's the xModel attribute in Alpine.js. This is a very commonly used one and is very useful, so worth knowing about. Now the next thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to define a list of people, and we're going to conditionally render an image based on whether a button is clicked. So let's start by defining a div here, and we're going to attach some xData to that div. And for now, we'll just close that off. And in here, I'm going to copy some data that I've got prepared, and we'll format that a little bit nicer. So basically this is an xData directive, and it's got as its data a key of people, which is a list of JavaScript objects. And we've got 2 people with names of Mark and Jeff, and I've got an image field which links to a placeholder image online. So what we're going to do within here is we're going to iterate over these people, and we're going to show attributes and the images. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the documentation. One of the other directives that Alpine.js provides is this x-for, and it allows you to create DOM elements by iterating through a list, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. Now there are 2 important rules when you're using the x-for directive. Firstly, it must be declared on a template element, and you can see that up here, a template element. Secondly, the template element must have only one root element within it. We're going to see what that means in a second. So let's go back to VS Code, and within this div I'm going to define a template element, and we'll define the x-for directive, and it's going to be for person in people. That's the syntax we use. So people refers to our key within the xData, and when we iterate over that, the actual name of the variable at each iteration is going to be person. So it's like a for loop. And within the template we need one root element, so I'm going to make that a div. And then within the div we're going to render out the name of the person. So we use the xText attribute to do that, and we can then say person.name, and we refer to person, which is the iteration name of the variable, and the name comes from the key within each JavaScript object. So that gives us the name. If we save that and go back to the front end, we should now be able to see the two names of our people, Mark and Jeff, which corresponds to the names within this JavaScript object. So now we're going to add the image associated with each person. Now each object has an image key, as you can see here. So we'll define an HTML image element here. And what we can do is we can bind the source attribute of the image to the image property here. So what I'm going to do is x-bind, this is another Alpine.js directive, and we will bind the source attribute of the image to the person.image field here. So we are looping over each person in this people list, and we're binding the image's source to the person.image, which will be this here. So if we save that, we need to close the tag first. If we save that now and go back to the front end and refresh, we should now see these placeholder images for each of the people we have in our list. Now there is a shorthand way to do this binding. Instead of x-bind, we can actually just use the colon and then the attribute name. So in this case, colon source equals person.image. So if I refresh this page, it should still work. So that is a shorthand way of binding the attribute of a particular element to some state that you have in your X data. So we're now going to give users the ability to toggle these images that you see on the front end, and they can show the images or hide the images using Alpine.js. So I'm going to add a new bit of state to our X data here, as well as the people. I'm going to add a new key that's going to be called 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗶𝗹, which will default to false in this case. So that's another key value pair, and it defaults to false. And what we want to do is we only want to show the image if this particular field is set to true. So if I add another element to the image, this is another Alpine element, it's called x-show, and you can bind that to a bit of state, and we'll say show images in here. So this is only going to show the image if this particular bit of state is equal to true, and currently it defaults to false. So if we refresh the front end, we will now see that we don't see those images at all. If we change this value to true, we should now see the images again on the front end. So what we want to do now is add a button that will allow us to dynamically change this data here from true to false and vice versa. So within our div here, we're going to add a button, and we're going to wire up a click handler here, and this is going to say show images. Now the click handler, what we're going to do is we're going to take the state show images, and we're going to set that to the inverse of show images. So if it's true, this line will change it to false, and if it's already false, it will then be set to true. And when the value of show images goes from true to false or vice versa, it will then toggle whether or not the images are shown on the front end. So if we go back to the page here, we now have this button here. If I click that, the images disappear, and if I click it again, the images appear. So that's all working as we expect. It's interactive, and we're using Alpine, and it's very lightweight. It's very easy to achieve these interactive tasks using this library. And we can also change the text displayed on this button, so it's always show images whether they're hidden or not. We want to change that so that when the images are not shown, you can click show images, but when they are shown, you can click hide images. So we're going to change the text within the button. So to do that, we get rid of the custom text that we've got here, and again we're going to add an attribute. It's going to be x-text, and this will define the text within the button. And I can use in here a JavaScript ternary expression, and a ternary expression is a shorthand way of doing an if-else statement. So if show images is true, we're going to set this to hide images, the text, otherwise we'll set it to show images. So if we go back to the front end and we refresh that, we can see we can hide images, and when we do that, the button's text changes to show images, and that's because when the images are shown, this is true, therefore we get the message of hide images. And when show images is false and the images are not on the page, then we have the text displaying show images instead. So we can dynamically change the actual text within the button, and indeed within any HTML elements, using the Alpine.js library. Now there are a couple of extra things I want to show you in this tutorial. We can also change classes dynamically using Alpine. So I'm going to add a class directive here. So we're going to bind the class, and we use this syntax to bind the class to a bit of state. Now in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to use a JavaScript expression here, and I'm going to say if the person's name, if it starts with, and this is a function on strings in JavaScript, starts with. If it starts with m, which will of course evaluate to true for Mark, but false for Jeff. But if that expression is true, we're going to give the text a class of text danger. Now this comes from Bootstrap. Let me move this to a new line. Bootstrap is loaded into the base.html template. So if the person's name starts with M, we're going to give it a text danger class, which will turn the text red. And otherwise we'll give it a text success class, which will make the text green. So if we refresh the front end, we should now see that Mark is red, and that's because his name starts with M, so it's given a class of text danger. Otherwise, anyone else who doesn't begin with M will have green text because it has the success class. So that's how easy it is to bind a class and change a class to bits of state and indeed to expressions in JavaScript. Very simple, but also very lightweight to do these basic tasks. Now Alpine also supports transitions when you have these x-show attributes. So when the x-show changes from true to false or vice versa, you can apply a transition, and this is a property called x-transition, and if you apply that, we should now see that when we hide the images, there is a small animation, a very small transition that's applied here, and you can customize this a little bit. So for example, we could set the duration, and we can say, let's say 1500 milliseconds, and if we refresh the front end now, you should see that that transition occurs a little bit more slowly, with a longer duration. So very easy to do transitions. In the documentation there is a page for this, and you can do some quite complicated custom transitions using CSS classes. Check the documentation for this. I'll leave a link in the description. Now there's one final thing I want to work on in this video. I want to fetch data from the server and use that data within an xData directive. So we have xData, as you can see here. We want to populate that from the server. So let's see how to do that just now. There's another Alpine attribute called x-init, and this allows you to hook into the initialization phase of any element in Alpine. And as it says here, consider an example where x-init is used to fetch JSON data and store it within xData before the component is processed. So x-init, you can use a library such as Axios, or you can use the fetch API to get data from your backend, convert that to JSON, and then store that within xData. So we're going to change the index here. We're going to change the xData. I'm going to get rid of this people array, and we're going to fetch this from the backend. So let's get rid of that, and we'll set people initially to be an empty list to give it some initial state. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Django view, and it's going to be called people, and it's going to be responsible for returning JSON data to our Alpine component. So I'm going to paste in here a Python list which has got the dictionaries that represent our people that we had on the front end, and then what we can do is return a JSON response which you will need to import from Django's HTTP module. We can return a JSON response with those people, and we need to say safe equals false here, and this safe equals false, by default it's true, and if it's true it will prevent you returning anything except a dictionary as part of the JSON response. In this case we have a list of dictionaries, so I'm going to say safe equals false, which means that any object can be serialized and returned. So now that we have the view, I'm going to quickly create a URL for this view, and it's going to be at this link people here, and it will link to the view that we've just created. And the final step here is we need to go back to index.html, and we have the xData here. I'm going to add another Alpine directive called x-init, and if we go back to the documentation we can copy this line here, and I'll amend this in a second, and let's paste that in here. The variable is called posts. In our case it's called people, so we'll set that to people, and we'll say this is going to be fetching the people endpoint here that we've just created the URL for here, and that will fetch that endpoint. It will await the response, and then it will await the response being converted to JSON as is seen here. Now the reason for the two awaits, these are both promises. The first one is waiting for the response, and then when we have the response we are awaiting the conversion of that response to JSON data. So we have to have two awaits here, but the end result of that is that the data being returned from our backend endpoint will be stored within the people field in our xData. So you can use x-init to fetch data from a server or any remote location and populate the xData fields accordingly. So if I save this and we go back to the page, let's refresh that, and now you still see the same data as we had before. I'm going to add a time.sleep call to the view, and this will simulate a bit of latency. So we'll import Python's time module, and we'll say time.sleep. Let's sleep for 1 second. If we save that and refresh, we see that it doesn't appear immediately, but after 1 second the request completes, the response is received, and Alpine.js will then populate the people field, which will then render our for loop of people. So that's everything I wanted to show you in the introductory video. If we go back to the documentation, we've seen the majority of the important directives defined here. I think all of these ones we've seen examples of, with the exception of x-HTML. So this demonstrates what Alpine offers you, and it works well with libraries such as htmx. We're going to explore how to work with Django and Django's models and ORM in later videos, and how you can load data into Alpine.js and create interactive functionality. So thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed, please check out the blog post, like the video and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.